Wednesday night about faith being based on evidence, and I think we probably sufficiently made the point. I didn't exhaust the topic by any stretch of the imagination, but the point that I really want us to see is not that other interpretations don't make sense based on some of the evidence. I think sometimes that's the way we want to look at it, is we look at anybody that holds a naturalistic view or an evolutionary viewpoint as being illogical. The reality is that some of the evidence can certainly be interpreted in a number of different ways, just looking at it from the surface. Question becomes, when all of the evidence is piled up, what does the preponderance of evidence suggest? Is a naturalistic viewpoint more in line with what we see and observe in the evidence that's around us? Or is it more logical to come to the conclusion that there is a God who created the universe and everything that's in it and continues to sustain it? Does the Bible show evidence of being just any other piece of literature, or are there unique characteristics in the Bible that demonstrate it to be of divine inspiration? And so that's the real question, is when we look at all the evidence, which one explains the evidence better than the others? And so that was the real point I wanted us to recognize, is that there is evidence for our faith. It's not just that we blindly accept what we've always been taught, or what the people that we like to hang out with believe. That there is evidence behind that, and faith is not just a blind trust in some unknown out there. And so faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. And then he goes on to talk about verse 2, for by it the people of old received their commendation. By faith we understand that the universe was created by the word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things that are visible. There was a big fancy word theologians used, ex nihilo, I think is the word, which means out of nothing. And that's the concept that's talked about here in this particular passage. And then beginning in verse 4, we start having this, some have called it the hall of faith. All of these faithful people down through the generations, the centuries before, who have lived by faith in God. And it's what is significant, and I think I asked in the questions, but what is significant about every one of those examples that is important, especially in the world in which we live, where faith only is spoken of, and what's meant by that? What was that? Okay, there's an action in every one of them. I mean, we begin in verse 4 with, by faith Abel did what? Offered a more excellent sacrifice. And so, I mean, one of the things you can do as you go through this text is, verse 4, by faith Abel offered. And I mean, you can just stop there. By faith Abel offered. That's an action verb. By faith Abraham obeyed, verse 8. And so on and so forth. You just keep going through the list of all of these people who are named, and by faith they did things. And so the point is that biblical faith, trust in God, belief in God, if we want to use that particular word, it's not an improper translation to use belief for faith. I just think that it's perhaps a little too superficial, especially in the climate in which we live, where essentially the belief is, the faith-only doctrine that's proclaimed in most of the denominational world, is the idea that all you have to do is believe in God, and especially believe in Christ, and you're saved. And the point is that when you read the Bible, it becomes pretty evident that biblical faith is trust in God, belief in God that leads to action. And so it happens in every one of these instances that we see that they all did something because of their faith in God, their trust in God. They were called on to live in a certain way, and that's what they did because they believed in God, they trusted in Him, and so they followed Him. By faith, Abel offered to God a more acceptable sacrifice, more excellent sacrifice, depending on the translation, than Cain did, through which he was commended as righteous, God commending him by accepting his gifts, and through his faith, though he died, he still speaks. By faith, Enoch did what? Well, but before that, but he was taken up, and why was that? Later in the text. It's actually a little later in this one. Because he pleased God, so whatever God called on him to do, he strove to do. He strove to live by that. And so he walked with God in the way that he lived each day, and the end result was that he was taken up so that he should not see death. Then there's a statement made in verse 6 that I think is important for us to focus on. And what is it?
Can't please God without faith.
You can't please God without faith. Because those who believe must do what? Two things are mentioned in this text again, and emphasizes the point that we've already talked about. You must first off what? You've got to first off believe in Him. I mean, there's something to be said about belief, right? If you don't believe in God, if you don't believe there is a God, if you don't believe the Bible's His inspired word, then what? I mean, this is the same point Paul makes in Romans chapter 10, by the way. I mean, why would, okay, if I don't believe there's a God, I believe the Bible's just another book, then it might be an interesting book to read, but I mean, it's not going to change my life per se any more necessarily than any other book that I might read. And so if we don't believe there is a God, there's no real reason to do the things that He says, unless we just agree with them, we think they're good. And so we look at that and we say, yeah, well, that makes sense, so I'll do that. But that's not really faith, is it? That's not really belief. That's just, well, I've just validated what I already believe to be true, and so I'm going to continue to live in that. Yeah, it's encouraged me to live a certain way, but it's the way that I thought I probably should anyway. It makes sense to me. That's not faith. Faith is a belief that there is a God, that God is, and what else? Last part of verse 6. Jim already said it once, but okay, He is a rewarder of those who, there's a little more to it, those who seek Him, but there's another word in most of the translations. Diligently seek Him. And I do think that's important. Maybe it's just a little bit of semantics, but I mean, diligently seeking God presents to us this idea of, and I think Gary Henry wrote a book called Diligently Seeking God, a devotional book, but likely based on this verse, Hebrews 11, verse 6, knowing Gary. And so God, it is impossible to please God without faith. For those who would come to Him must believe that He is, and that He is a rewarder of those who diligently seek Him. And so what we see then in all of these people that are listed in this book, or this chapter, many of whom are mentioned by name, but many more toward the end, there are a few things that are mentioned about various people. And their names are not given, just what they did is listed for us. And so there are a whole lot more people who have lived by faith, diligently seeking after God, whose names are not listed in this book. And there's a lot more that have lived even beyond the time of the writing of this book. And so those who do that, believe God, and diligently seek Him, will be rewarded. Yes, sir.
As you've alluded to, faith is a action word. It's a verb. And I think everything that shows in here is saying that that belief is more than a verbal assent. It is what spurs us to action.
Yes.
That belief at that depth that it spurs us to action.
Yes. And I mean, again, are there some things God tells us to do that make sense to us? Sure there are. I mean, there are things that we read and we go, well, that just makes good sense, right? I mean, some of the things God tells us, interestingly enough, are things that are observable. I mean, we look at them in the world around us. We see people who apply the principles of the Bible versus people who don't. And in some of those instances, we can see a direct correlation between success in people who apply them and failure in people who don't. There are people who've written all kinds of self-help books that are not truly biblically based in the sense that they don't quote Scripture and they don't talk about God and all of that. But they've taken principles that are biblical principles that they recognize in the business world or in the other aspects of the world that we live in are principles that provide success or lead to success for people. And so they've written these books that are bestsellers and have sold millions of copies, and everybody talks about them. This is just a great book. It motivated me to do this, that, or the other. And the reality is that in many cases, those are biblical principles. And so a lot of what God says does make sense. Now, here's the next question, though. Are there things God says that don't make any sense to us? Oh, come on. Yes. I mean, I know that I make us uncomfortable all the time asking us questions like that, but there's nothing to be uncomfortable about. There are things God asks us to do that don't make any sense to us at all. Why is that? Huh? His ways are not our ways. That's the first thing we need to recognize is God is not a man. He is not us. We are created in His image. Does that mean we're exactly like Him? There's some aspect of us that is made like Him. I think I know what that is, but I don't know that I do for sure. I just have drawn conclusions. But the point is, God is not like us. We are not like Him in every sense. We don't think like He thinks. He doesn't think like we think. And there are a lot of reasons for that, not the least of which He is infinite, sees everything, and knows history from before it began until after it's ended. He knows all of those things that are going to transpire in between the beginning and the end. And so that makes Him privy to information that we don't have. And so He thinks in a different way, and He's not thinking about just one individual. He's thinking about all of the individuals that He's created, which makes Him unique in that sense too. So God's ways are not our ways. Why else does, and this may be a presumption, but I think it's safe to assume because of what we talked about last Sunday in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, why else does God sometimes tell us to do things that don't make any sense?
Yes, but they will actually do it.
Okay, that was the presumption I'm drawing, and I'm drawing it on the basis in part of 1 Corinthians chapter 1, where it says that God has chosen the foolish things of the world to, I can't remember the rest of it now, but essentially, God has chosen things that men viewed as foolish to make fools of the wise, so to speak. And He has chosen things that men considered to be weakness to weaken the strong. And ultimately, God has chosen things so that in the end, when we submit to Him and follow His ways, who gets credit for it? He does. Because it demonstrates that we trust in Him, even though what He says doesn't make any sense. And I talked a little bit about Jericho. Do you think it made any sense? I mean, really, honestly, did it make any sense to Joshua or to Israel or certainly to the people of Jericho, that these foolish Israelites were marching around this city 13 times. That make any sense? And then they got done marching all that way, and they started blowing trumpets and shouting. What a bunch of idiots, right? That's what everybody thought. And I mean, I have to think there were at least some in the camp of Israel that after a day or two of marching around that big city, thought, what in the world are we doing? This doesn't make any sense at all. But the point is what? And we see statements like this throughout, especially the Old Testament. The point is, has God demonstrated the fact that even when it doesn't make any sense, we should trust Him? Absolutely. And that's where that evidence comes in back in the beginning of this text, is have you witnessed enough evidence, have you seen enough evidence to develop within yourself a faith that is strong enough that when God tells you to do something that doesn't make any sense to you whatsoever. Do you think it made any sense to Abraham? We're going to talk about this one later in the text. You think it made any sense to Abraham when God finally, after 25 years, gave him a son that was going to be the heir of promise, and then said to him, you know what? Here's what I want you to do. I want you to take that son up to Mount Moriah, and I want you to offer him up as a sacrifice to me. You think that made any sense at all? No, it didn't make any sense. So why did Abraham do it? Because he had seen enough evidence in his lifetime that God had earned his trust to the point that he said, and we see what he believed in this text, which is a really interesting insight into Genesis 22 that we don't see over there, that we'll talk about when we get there. But he had seen enough evidence in his life to believe that God knew what he was doing and that he was worthy of his trust, even if it meant sacrificing his only son. And only son is the word that's used in this text because he was the son of promise. Andrew.
I agree that we can face things that we don't understand what God is doing or what God's intent is, so we don't understand it. I think where faith comes in and makes the difference is, do you respond to that lack of understanding with acceptance or frustration? And I tend to lean toward it's a sign of faith if you can face uncertainty without frustration. Abraham, I don't think there's any indication in the text that Abraham was visibly or emotionally frustrated with God as he was carrying out that obedience, because faith enabled him to completely surrender to knowing that God is going to do something. His statement to Isaac is, God is going to provide a sacrifice. And he didn't say that wasn't going to be Isaac. He just knows God is going to do something. So he didn't act with frustration. He obeyed God, and though he didn't understand, didn't let himself spiral into truly doubting God or becoming angry at God while still carrying it out. It's not a begrudging obedience of faith. I don't know that the people were marching around Jericho and they started grumbling and complaining. I think a true act of faith is one that says, I know God is going to do something even if I don't understand, so I don't have to get all out of sorts over something I don't understand.
Yeah, and I think we see that in Joshua. I think Joshua even makes a statement kind of similar to that, that the Lord is going to go before his army, and the Lord will provide. And of course, Moses, when he was at the Red Sea and Egypt had surrounded them from behind, said, see the salvation of the Lord. You're right. In fact, in this text, the Hebrew writer tells us, what did Abraham believe? What had he reasoned through in his mind? That God is even able to raise him from the dead, which is very significant. It wouldn't be that significant for us on this side of the cross, because what did Jesus do a number of times? I read somewhere the other day, somebody said Jesus ruined every funeral he ever went to. I don't know that that's the way I would view it. Maybe from the perspective of those who had died, I still feel for poor Lazarus. I don't know what that was like. I hope God kind of cleansed his memory of whatever paradise was like since he was there for 4 days. But anyway, what did Jesus do at a number of funerals that he went to during his ministry? Raise people from the dead. So from this side of the cross, maybe not such a big deal to believe that God could raise him from the dead. But had Abraham, as far as we know, ever witnessed anything like that? I was waiting. It's a trick question. No. Yes. No. He had never witnessed anybody physically raised from the dead as far as we know. But according to Romans 4, what had he witnessed that had been resurrected from the dead? Sarah's womb. It had never born at all during her lifetime, and she was well past the childbearing years. And so God had given life to her dead womb, is the way that it's put in Romans 4. And essentially even Abraham himself, I mean, how old was he when Isaac was born? 100 years old. Yeah, I mean, he was beyond the age too. So God gave both of them the ability to bring forth life. And so he had seen life come from the dead in some sense, in that sense. But as far as a body physically being raised after dying, he had not, as far as we know, he hadn't witnessed that. But anyway, let's go back because there are earlier things about Abraham. In verse 8, what did Abraham do? Abraham's life is pretty remarkable when you look at it from the perspective of faith. And what we've been talking about with regard to continuing to believe even when things don't make any sense. Because the first thing Abraham does when he's 75 years old is what?
Packed up his house and moved.
Yeah, he packs up everything he owns, all of his family, all of his household. I mean, I can't imagine what that caravan looked like. And they left home to go to a land that God would show them. It was just across town, right? It'd be a long journey, even if we had to drive it today. I mean, it still would take a little while, but they were on foot and hauling a bunch of animals with them. And so it was a long journey, and they couldn't just go the direct route. They couldn't go, as we would say, as the crow flies, because it was a great big huge desert between where they were and where they were going. So they had to take the big long route up to the northwest, around through Mesopotamia, and then down to the south. And so Abraham leaves home, and his family, and his father's household, and all those people that he'd grown up with before, leaves home and goes to the land of Canaan because, why? Because God said to. Now, in the context of Hebrews, it becomes pretty evident this is not the first time Abraham's talked to God, right? I mean, we're not supposed to believe, and I think that's one of the other things we need to do when we look at the gospel accounts, for example, is look at the full picture of all four gospels, because sometimes it looks like Jesus just walks up to people and says, you know what, I want you to follow me, and they just leave everything behind and follow this strange Jew that comes walking up to, well, I mean, they were all Jews, but this strange man who comes walking up to them and says, come follow me. And they drop everything and just follow him. Clearly, that's not what is being talked about here, and it's not what's being talked about there. Faith is based on evidence. They had seen something or heard something that had been preached or taught about him by someone that they knew and trusted and believed in. And so Abraham, this was not his first experience with God. God didn't just come all of a sudden and say, okay, this guy's 75 years old. I'm going to call him, go to Canaan. He tells him, pick up all your stuff and leave, and Abraham does it. He's likely had a lifetime at this point of developing a relationship with God. And so God calls him to go to a foreign land, and he leaves. And when he gets there, he doesn't really talk about that, but when he gets there, what does he find? You remember? What's the state of the land when he gets to Canaan? Yeah, there was a famine there. Perfect, right? He's been living up in Mesopotamia, and there's another name for Mesopotamia, right? What anybody remember from school? The Fertile Crescent. Yeah, it's a name that's probably given to it because of the fertility of the land. So he's been living there, and he goes to Canaan because God calls him out to go to Canaan, and he gets there, and there's a famine. Oh, this is great. Wonderful. And so he has to go a little further south and go to Egypt for a while, right? So, I mean, this whole story, all along the way, it's just like every time he does what God says, there seems to be this new obstacle. You ever feel like that? You ever feel like sometimes every time you try to do the right thing, there's a new obstacle? Sometimes that happens. It happened to Abraham. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I was just kind of looking at one of my things I've got left in my Bible from years ago, and one of them's a Bible timeline, and it's got from Shem to Abraham. Well, Abraham's grandfather was dead not too long after and his great-great-grandfather, but he goes all the way. Shem, his eighth great-grandfather, is still alive for most of his life.
Right.
And so, and there's several others that are, if you backtrack through, he's got multiple, up to 8 or 9 generations that he can, of God-fearing men, especially Shem, right, who witnessed as about as extreme an event as ever happened on this earth.
Right.
It was the most extreme event that ever happened on this earth, other than Christ coming, I guess.
Right.
But as far, so he's got a family that has a very, close knowledge of God, and they're, we wonder what happened, how the patriarchs knew how to serve God, and they lived for a long time in those generations, and
they did.
They could, he had access to people who, could firsthand tell them stories of things that happened that God did for them.
Right. Yeah, it's really not until we get to even Jacob that we start getting more toward the lifespans that we're a little more accustomed to now. So yeah, there were a lot of people, and you brought up Shem, which reminds me, I skipped a by faith. Who was it? I think I heard it. Noah. What did Noah do by faith? He built a great big boat. I don't know, would that be a ship, Chuck? It'd be a ship, wouldn't it? It's pretty big. Those Navy guys don't like to call them boats. They're ships, right? Is that right? Depends on the size of it. But speaking of the ark that Noah built, by the way, is a pretty significant piece of evidence for the Bible and for inspiration. If you wanted to look into that a little bit more, because there are lots of other flood stories in the ancient world that existed way back then, and a lot of the other boats that were built don't make any sense whatsoever. Noah's not only makes sense, it's actually still considered to be the perfect ratio for boat building if you're trying to build a large cargo ship that doesn't need to be maneuverable. It just needs to carry a lot of stuff and to float on the water. So that is millennia ago, long before people got into the real science of shipbuilding. Noah could not have known how to build a boat like that without divine guidance, and that's what happened. So he constructed an ark for the saving of his household. And there's an interesting statement that's found here in this particular text in verse 7. By this he condemned the world and became an heir of the righteousness that comes by faith. It doesn't say that God condemned the world. It says Noah, by his act of faith, condemned the world. Any idea what that might mean? That's right. Yeah, we're told in, I think it's 1 Peter 3, that he was a preacher of righteousness. And he was preaching this message the whole time he's building this boat. And there's some speculation as to how long he was building, but it seems like 100, 120 years or so was how long this construction project was going on. If you have some idea of construction in the ancient world and the size of that ship, and like the likelihood that he may not have had a whole lot of extra help, you understand why it took so long. And God intentionally, based on other passages we see, took a long time allowing that message to be preached, because the reality is that when you look at the ship and you look at all that it had to hold, what was there likely a lot of? This is something that first was brought to my attention by a group called Answers in Genesis. What was there likely a lot of on the ark? Extra space. That would make sense, would it not? Because did God intend to only save 8 people? I mean, if he only built the boat big enough to haul all the animals and the food stores and stuff that need to be stored, and 8 people, what would that say to everybody else? It doesn't matter if we change our mind or not, there's not any room on the boat. And so, I mean, we couldn't go anyway. So there was likely a lot of empty space, because, I mean, as Jesus said, in my Father's house there are many rooms, right? I mean, God wanted more than just 8 people. Now, he knew how many were going to be on that ship, but he had Noah preaching all this time about the coming flood. And so because Noah was preaching that, and because he provided a means through faith in God that could provide deliverance and salvation, he ultimately, through his actions, condemned the world that existed then, and became an heir of the righteousness that comes by faith. So, and I know there's speculation in verse 7 about Noah being warned by God concerning events as yet unseen. Some people say, well, it had never rained on the earth. I don't know whether it had rained on the earth or not. That's really not the point. I mean, I guess it could be. But had Noah or anybody else ever seen a flood like this? No. I mean, I don't know if they'd witnessed local floods or not, but they certainly had not witnessed anything of this magnitude. And so he was warned of something that was going to eradicate all life on the earth, all in whose nostrils the breath of life was found from the earth, and require the repopulating of the earth afterwards. And nobody had ever witnessed that. But Noah believed enough to construct an ark to save his family. So, okay, so back to Abraham. So we've got Abraham leaving home and going to this foreign land. And we've got then verse 11, the first female mentioned in Hebrews 11. By faith, Sarah herself received power to conceive, even when she was past the age, since she considered him faithful who had promised. And then there's that statement that Greg was talking about in verse 12. Therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead, were born descendants as many as the stars of the heavens, and as many as the innumerable grains of sand by the seashore. Did Abraham see that? No. In fact, most of what Abraham was promised, he never saw any of it. I mean, I guess if we take the letter of what was promised to him, He didn't see any of it because seeing his descendants multiplied to this number, didn't see it. Did he see his family inherit the land of Canaan? Didn't see it. Did he see the seed promise fulfilled in Christ? Not in his lifetime. But Jesus says what in John? That's why I kind of hesitated after I said that. He saw my day and rejoiced. So he didn't see it in his lifetime. So Michaela was right, and that was really where I was going when I asked the question. But then after I said that, I paused because I remembered the statement of Jesus in John that Abraham saw my day and rejoiced. So he did see it, just not while he was alive. So while he was alive, which was the real question I was asking, he didn't see any of it. Isaac didn't see any of it. Jacob didn't see any of it. So what gives? Verses 13 through 16 tell us. And I'll tell you, this section, 13 through 16, is a passage we ought to think about a lot. Did Abraham receive any of the promises he was promised? No. And yet, what did he do? He still did what? He still remained faithful. Because he was living for what? He was living for something better. He was living for a city whose builder and maker is God. He was living for the eternal reward and rest that God provides for us. So he wasn't living for the physical blessings. Would they have been nice? Do you think the blessings he did enjoy were still nice? Sure they were. He had a faithful wife. They seem to have had a wonderful, for the most part, relationship, other than when he brought Hagar into the picture. But otherwise, they had a good marriage. They finally were blessed with Isaac, and then Jacob and Esau, and all of that. But so, they had a good life. They were blessed in a lot of ways, but he never received the promises that he was longing for, and that God promised to him. But he was living for something greater, and that's the part that I think we should commit to memory and remind ourselves of frequently is sometimes things in this life don't go the way we would like for them to, right? Sometimes it's more frequent than we would prefer. Sometimes it feels like the negative outweighs the positive. But at times like that, what do we need to remember? God always keeps his promises. God is always faithful. And what do we sometimes sing? Is it 230, 280? Yeah, that's right. I can't remember which one it is. Is it 230? This world is not my home. We sing that, right? Do you believe that? Our citizenship is in heaven, Philippians 3:20. Our citizenship is in heaven. We are living for the city whose builder and maker is God. This is not the world that we ultimately are going to be in forever. So this place is temporary. And that can be helpful. It doesn't erase the pain. It doesn't erase the heartache. But it can be helpful for us to remember that because we were never intended, since the fall, we've never been intended to live here forever. This has always been a temporary situation. And so ultimately, we're longing for the time when we can leave this life and go to be with God. And I don't know the fullness of what they understood when Abraham and Isaac and Jacob lived, but I know they knew enough to know that there was more than just what was here. And so because the Hebrew writer tells us they were longing for a city whose builder and maker is God. And therefore, verse 16, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. There's also another interesting statement found in verse 15. that makes evident the free will aspect of this whole proposition. Because what does the Hebrew writer remind us? If they at any point had decided it's not worth it, what could they do? They could always go back to where they came from. They could always go back to living the way they were living before and to doing what they were doing then. They always had that choice. And so we have that choice too. If at any point we decide we're getting a raw deal, things aren't going the way we thought they would, and we're not sure this is going to turn out how we thought, we can always go back to what we were doing before. Choice is always available. But then we forfeit the promises that God has provided for those who diligently seek after Him and remain faithful. And so Abraham longed for that. And so he lived for it his entire life. He led Isaac and Jacob to look at things in the same way. So we'll start in verse 17, Lord willing, on Wednesday night and work our way through the rest of this chapter. We may try to get through the rest of chapter 11 on Wednesday night if we're able, so we can get into chapter 12 a little bit. We've only got a few weeks of class left. So appreciate the help this morning, and look forward to our assembly and our worship together here.